Have you ever noticed that we sometimes say things to ourselves that we would never say to a child we love, or to a friend who is struggling, or to someone who simply made a mistake? And yet, somehow, when it comes to ourselves, those same words can feel normal. And after a while, we stop questioning them. Welcome to Soul Time, a show that explores the world of unlocking your unique potential. My name is Dr. Katja Makowka, and I'm a teacher at school, a former teacher at universities, and a stress and mental coach. And I'm your host. The longest relationship we will ever have is the relationship with ourselves. Long before we speak to anyone else in the morning, we are already having conversations in our own minds. Some are encouraging, some are neutral, and some are surprisingly harsh. And the interesting thing is that most of the time we aren't even aware of it. The voice has become so familiar that it blends into the background. It sounds like, I should have done better. Or, why did I say that? Or, I should be further along by now. Or, everyone else seems to have figured this out. Not necessarily loud, not dramatic, just small comments repeated often enough that they begin to feel like facts. And maybe that's why this matters so much, because the voice we hear most often is our own. And over time, those quiet thoughts shape how we see ourselves, how we approach challenges, and how we recover from mistakes. And if we are honest, many of us would never speak to someone else the way we sometimes speak to ourselves. Imagine a child comes home from school after making a mistake. Maybe they forgot something important. Or maybe they didn't perform as well as they hoped. And maybe they feel disappointed. And most of us wouldn't immediately say, "What's wrong with you?" Or, "You always mess things up." We would probably sit beside them, listen, and offer perspective and remind them that one moment does not define who they are. We would naturally extend kindness. And yet, when we are the ones who make a mistake, that kindness often disappears. Instead of curiosity, we choose criticism. And instead of understanding, we choose judgment. And sometimes we do it so automatically that we don't even realize there is another option. I think many of us learned this without intending to. We grew up in cultures, schools, workplaces, and environments that often focused more on outcomes than growth. And mistakes were highlighted. Success was celebrated. And slowly, many people began connecting their worth to performance, not because anyone explicitly taught them to do that, but because that's often the message hidden beneath the surface. If things go well, we feel good about ourselves. And if things don't go well, we question ourselves. And over time, self-criticism starts to feel like responsibility, as if being hard on ourselves is what keeps us improving. But there is a difference between accountability and self-attack. A very important difference. We can acknowledge mistakes without turning against ourselves. We can learn from an experience without humiliating ourselves for having it. And we can take responsibility while still treating ourselves with dignity. In fact, real growth often becomes easier when shame is removed from the equation, because shame rarely creates lasting change. It usually creates fear. Awareness creates change. Compassion creates change. And reflection creates change. And maybe that's something many of us are still learning, because being kind to ourselves doesn't mean avoiding responsibility. It doesn't mean lowering our standards, and it doesn't mean pretending everything is okay when it isn't. It simply means we stop making ourselves the enemy every time we struggle. And that's important. And perhaps one of the most important reasons this conversation matters is because children are listening, not only to what we say to them in specific situations, but to what we say about ourselves. They hear if when we constantly criticize our appearance. They hear it when we call ourselves stupid for making a mistake. They hear it when we dismiss our efforts or focus only on what went wrong. And little by little, they begin to learn what an inner dialogue sounds like, because children often learn how to speak to themselves by listening to how adults speak to themselves. And that's a powerful thought. If children spend a day listening to our inner dialogue, what would they learn about self-worth? What would they learn about mistakes? What would they learn about being human? Because none of us are perfect. We all have moments we wish we could handle differently. And we all make decisions we would change in hindsight. We all have days where we feel tired and overwhelmed, uncertain, or even frustrated. And that's not failure. That's life. And maybe the goal was never to become someone who never struggles. Maybe the goal is to become someone who can meet those struggles with a little more compassion, a little more patience, a little more understanding. Not because we deserve special treatment, but because we are human. And human beings learn, grow, adjust, and evolve. So maybe today is simply an invitation to notice, not to judge your thoughts, not to force positivity, just to notice. Notice the way you speak to yourself after a mistake. Notice what happens when things don't go according to plan. Notice the small comments that have become so familiar you hardly hear them anymore. Because awareness is often where change begins. And maybe the next time life feels difficult, we can ask ourselves a different question. Not what's wrong with me, but what would I say to someone I deeply care about if they were in this exact situation? Because perhaps we deserve some of that same kindness too. And maybe one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves and the children who are watching us is showing that growth and compassion can exist in the same space. That mistakes don't diminish our worth, and that the way we speak to ourselves truly matters. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Soul Time. I'm very grateful because you have given me the greatest treasure of your life, your time. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button so that you get a notification every time a new episode is out.